Welcome back. So in the last video we talked about insights that can come from a very general analysis, looking at the overall mound production and analyzing that using L analysis. But now what we want to do is examine in more detail when disturbances are occurring. In this slide, what I'm doing is showing a breakdown of when disturbances occur during the year. So we start early on, go through year one, then we come to the second year of activity. And we can note a number of things in this pattern that are quite apparent. Mound production is not occurring at exactly an even rate during the entire year. There are periods of really high activity, as we can see here and here, and maybe a little bit in there. And there are periods where there's no activity at all. Basically this area in here, during the winter, the gophers are inactive completely. When spring comes along, we see that the activity picks up fairly rapidly. Probably a lot of repair of mounds that have fallen in or had other things happen to them during the winter. It's an period of time when there's a lot of growth underground of roots that the gophers are eating. And so this activity shifts in terms of what's happening during the year. And so what we want to do is take advantage of the fact that we measured mound production on a weekly basis and try and piece together different components of how this might affect the plant community and how the disturbance regime develops over time. So what we can do is take a look at how accumulation occurs over time. Here we have a map showing the first week during the growing season in our plot, and we can see that a number of mounds have been produced. Just eyeballing it, I would say there are about 40 mounds here that are revealed once the snow melts off. If we come back another week later, we see that mounds have been added in, so there's been a lot more activity. And we can see some of the relationships where there were a couple of mounds here, and now those two mounds are there. There were some mounds in this area, and there's been a lot more activity during the second week that has added more mounds to the system. We can continue doing this. We can look at 3 weeks after the beginning of the growing season and activity of the gophers. We come back in 4 weeks, and you can see that there's a very large difference between week 1 and week 4. There's been a lot of activity through this entire period of time. And if we take a look at this, we might imagine that the pattern that we would assess would be very different depending upon whether we analyze the system here versus down here. And so one of the things we wanted to do was to understand this change in pattern by analyzing it on a weekly basis or as the mounds accrued over time. And so we did this in a specific sort of way. What we did is we took all the mounds produced during each and every 1 week time period and analyzed those separately, and then averaged the L curves over all of those weeks to get an idea of what mound formation looks like in terms of its pattern over a 1 week period. Then we took all contiguous 2 week periods. So this would be something like taking week 1 and week 2, analyzing that, then taking week 2 and week 3, pooling those together, analyzing that, et cetera, for different numbers of contiguous weeks. So 1 week stretches, 2 week stretches, 3 week, et cetera, to see how our understanding or view of the pattern shifts when we take into account different time frames. So let's take a look at how the pattern shifts when we take into account longer time periods. So what we can see here is an L analysis for all the pooled 1 week periods of mound production. And we can see some interesting things in this pattern. So we start off here with very little, a low value of L. It peaks really rapidly and then tails off down again to around 20 meters, which is what we saw in the overall analysis. And we can see that the peak here coincides with a scale of around 5 meters. And so this suggests that during a 1 week period, this 5 meters is maybe sort of a general rule of thumb as to clustered activity in the mound production process, and that if we look at a broader scale, there's still clustering within that 20-meter range within territories, and then beyond that, it looks somewhat random. If we go to a 2-week assessment, so this is pooling together 2-week periods of time in terms of the analysis, we see that one of the things is that there's a general decrease in the degree of intensity of clustering, which suggests that the pattern is spreading out a little bit and becoming less clustered from the view of pattern analysis. The general form of the curve is basically the same. They parallel each other to quite an extent, although there is this general decrease. And so this suggests that that intensity of clustering that occurs during 1 week is still maintained a little bit, but it is weakening in terms of the strength of the clustering as we see in the diminishing of this peak. If we go to 3 weeks, we see that this progresses even further, and there's actually a suggestion perhaps that the peak is shifting to the right, meaning that the clustering is becoming more diffuse in space and covering a slightly broader area. So we continued doing this for a large number of intervals, and we stopped at doing an assessment of the 2-year pattern, which I think I've shown you before, so that there's still clustering in this system at that broad 20-meter scale, but the intensity of it and the concentration of the clustering is much less as the peak in clustering shifts in this direction. And so this gives us an understanding to some extent of how this pattern is developing over time in terms of what period of time we consider the process over. So it suggests that we can ask different questions by taking different time frames in terms of how the pattern develops, and we'll get a slightly different answer depending on how many weeks we consider in our analysis. And so I think this was a somewhat novel insight at the time to take a look in this way where we can get detailed information about these processes. If we go back to our map of rate of disturbance, we can see somewhat what's going on here. We can see that these 1 week periods of time cover about 5 meters. So this area in here, which is the mound opening, there is around a 5 meter scale, but if we look in other areas, the general pattern has a process of 5 meters in different areas. And so if we take a look, it may be that during 1 week we see activity in these 2 areas, just taking these 2 territories as an illustration. Could be that the next week they shift in where their activity is, and we see the pattern being formed there in terms of disturbance. If we come back a 3rd week, it may look something like this in terms of where they are. Now, we don't know sort of what the relationship is between these different zones of activity and the analysis we've just talked about. This is just speculation here, and it would take a slightly different form of analysis to get at this. And this is what we'll discuss in the type of analysis we do in the next video, which takes a slightly different approach to this whole process. Thank you.